Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this TrueAllele user seminar today. I'm Matt Legler here at Cybergenetics. What we'll have today is that Dr. Barry Duesman and Jay Caponera from the New York State Police will be discussing the introduction of the TrueAllele Casework software into their process there. So without further delay, I will hand it over to Dr. Duesman. Thank you very much.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Greetings from the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center and from our TrueAllele implementation group, most of whom are assembled here with me today. It's a pleasure to be able to be speaking with you today. I'm looking forward to sharing our most recent validation data and our implementation strategy going forward. Right now, we have about 25 staff members in various stages of training, and we're well poised to begin implementation of the program in our casework unit. In fact, within the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'll be picking our pilot case. It's been a pretty long road to get here. It's been over a decade, but I can finally say that our validation studies are now complete. In a minute or two, I'm going to turn over this program to forensic scientist Jay Caponera, who will be presenting our most recent work. And by ours, I mean his for the most part, because he has been instrumental in producing most of this data and, in fact, in doing most of the data interpretation as well. And he'll be presenting this validation data in the context of our implementation strategy for the software. Just a little bit of background, though. To validate this program for the implementation, we decided basically that we would follow the QAS guidelines. And what you'll find is the topics that we're looking at basically are the ones you might expect: specificity, sensitivity, reproducibility, concordance, and of course, casework like evidence. In fact, what we really dug in with originally was casework like samples. And that was because, well, we had just gotten this software. The state police had made a fairly substantial financial involvement in procuring it for us. We were eager to put it through its paces. The other reason arose a little later on, and that was basically our efforts to be in compliance with the SWGDM DNA data interpretation guidelines. Now, we are in full compliance right now, but it was a little bit of a struggle. We have 40 or 50 forensic scientists here. It varies from day to day, but we found it somewhat esoteric. And a lot of these scientists have given me the sense that they feel they're leaving a lot of our data on the cutting room floor. So what I wanted to provide is something a little bit more standard and more objective. And that's what I think we have with this software. All this work that we did originally, as I said, was basically done with adjudicated casework. And it pretty much spanned the entire spectra of cases that we get, everything from property crimes through violent crimes. And this is pretty much old data. As you can see, you can find it all pretty much published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences over the last decade, or also online at the TrueAllele website. But the data that was accumulated here in New York State, I think it's worthwhile to mention, was considered to be complete enough and comprehensive enough to get the approval of our state DNA subcommittee. And that approval was subsequently ratified by our State Commission on Forensic Science. And you can't see it very clearly, but the members of the committee are listed along the left-hand side there, and they include such familiar names as Ranjit Chakrabarty, who is now with the University of North Texas, and the late George Carmody, who at that time was with Carleton, and of course the chairman of the committee, Jack Ballantyne, who I think may be listening in today. So we had this approval back in May 2010, but I made the decision then that we didn't want to jump right in. We wanted to have a validation that was unassailable to our auditors. Because the other consideration, of course, we are an ISO 17025 laboratory, so that even though we had the approval to use the software, I wanted to make sure that we included a little bit more work on known mixtures so we could further confirm the advantages of the software, basically information retention, objectivity, standard approach, all those things, but also especially to test and establish the limits of its application. So that's basically what Jay is going to be talking about today is this is all new data, and we are, I think, at the finish line with this. It's time for us to boot it. We've been patient and very thorough, and we are going to begin our implementation of the software relatively soon. We have our last basically dry run going on now. So with that, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Jay. He's a natural choice because, as I mentioned, he did much of the work. He's been a driving force behind the implementation. He's a forensic scientist extraordinaire, a totally dedicated, consummate professional, and a delight to work with. Jay?
Hi, everyone. This is Jay. Thank you, Barry. And thanks to Cybergenetics for giving us the opportunity to share our data today. So today, really two main things that I wanted to talk about was the latest validation work that we just completed and how we're going to go about implementing that. And it's been months and months of work that's led up to this. For the validation itself, as Barry mentioned, we had already done quite a bit of work and published 2 papers on casework adjudicated cases. The data that I'm presenting today is our internal validation data that's on known samples. And for that validation, I'm going to be focusing on TrueAllele's performance on the low template DNA samples, 2- and 3-person mixtures, and our efforts to try to optimize the number of run cycles or MCMC cycles. Okay, so let's dive right into the data. This is the low template work that we did. And what you're looking at is 2 sets of single source samples that were serially diluted and amped at the concentrations that you see below on the x-axis, so 500 picograms all the way down to 3.9 picograms. And all of the TrueAllele runs were solved in duplicate. What we're doing here is comparing our normal match statistic, which is a conditional match probability, which we do with PopStats, and we're comparing that to the logs that we would get with TrueAllele, which is listed as TA. Just throughout the presentation, we'll be referring to these as log LRs. So we've taken the log of both the CMP and TrueAllele. So that's what we're comparing. So a couple things that I wanted to point out with this slide is on the right-hand side, when you have enough DNA, let's say 125 picograms and above, the match statistic that you get from TrueAllele is really identical to what you get with the more traditional PopStats conditional match probability. And we've got theta set to 1% for all these comparisons. So if you have enough DNA, the stats will be identical. Where TrueAllele exceeds is when you don't have enough DNA, and that's stochastic range. So between 15.6 and 62.5 picograms, the information gain that we're seeing with TrueAllele is 10 to the 6th. So quite a bit of information gain, or a million-fold increase in information at that low level. Also below that lowest level, 15.6 picograms, we're just not able to provide any match information. There's just not enough information there for the software to do anything with. So that's kind of a limit of detection of the software. I hope you can see this okay. So this is an example of one of the 15.6 picogram samples, single source sample. And you can see that there are only 2 alleles above our peak detection threshold, which is 50 RFUs. And there's only 1 allele at D3, which is above our stochastic threshold. This is identifier plus, which is 140 RFUs. And you can see just by looking at it, there's a whole lot of peak activity below threshold. TrueAllele also sees all that activity below threshold. It's able to model that uncertainty and provide a match statistic of 10 to the 11th. Whereas with PopStats, the threshold-based method, the best that you can get is 1 in 5. As a scientist, obviously this is something that you would just call insufficient, but we're still calculating a stat for comparison. So with probabilistic genotyping in general, it's kind of a brave new world on the types of samples that we're able to report on. Okay, so Barry mentioned specificity as one of the things that we're looking at in this validation. So what we mean by specificity is quantifying the extent of the difference between non-donors and the actual donors. So this is the same data set as before. You can see the serial dilutions on the x-axis. And what I've done here is take 19 non-donor staff profiles, these are just people from our laboratory, and see what the difference is between the actual logs that they are and the logs from the donors. So again, we're looking at separation here between non-donor and the donor. And you can see that there's quite a bit of separation, something like 20, 30 log units or more. And the maximum separation is achieved with TrueAllele at with as little as 62.5 picograms. And below that, it gets more narrow, as you might expect. And this also underscores the limit of the software at somewhere around 15.6 picograms. Below that, you'll still see that there is some separation between the donor and the non-donor, but TrueAllele is not able to give that a positive match score, and you can see that it's below 0, which is what that dotted line is. Okay, so this is really the same data and the table format, and just two things that I wanted to focus on this slide. On the far right-hand side is a column that says minimum donor, non-donor separation. So what's the minimum separation that we have between the donors and the non-donors? And for the two lowest ones, 3.9 and 7.8 picograms, there really is no separation, but once you jump up to that 15.6 picogram amount, which is kind of a magic number, all of a sudden you've got separation of 10 to the 8th, so a huge jump between the non-donors and the donors match statistics. Another thing I wanted to point out is that there was one instance, and this is at the bottom of the slide, where a non-donor log likelihood ratio exceeded the actual known donor. This was for one 7.8 picogram sample. It was not reproducible, but in the end, all of the non-donors were still negative. Okay, onto reproducibility. So what this slide is showing again with the single source data is the replication between the two TrueAllele requests that we did for all of these samples. So just A and B is what I parsed it out into. So you can see that the within group standard deviation is 0.188, or a fifth of a log unit, so really small. And it's tight even at the 31 picogram sample and above. Below that, as you might expect, it's extremely stochastic. The standard deviation is going to go up, and again, below that 15.6 picogram sample, we just don't have enough match information there. Okay, so this is the first of the mixture series data. This is two-person mixtures, and what you're looking at is two sets of mixture samples, and both were, again, solved in duplicate with TrueAllele. So we've got a suite of mixture ratios down the bottom. There are 5 separate ones. And what you're looking at here is the match scores for TrueAllele versus the inclusion method that we currently use in our laboratory, CPI, or combined probability of inclusion, which you might also know as random band not excluded. There are TA1 and 2 because for mixture profiles, TrueAllele is separating that mixture into the individual component genotypes. So for a two-person mixture, which is what all these are, you've got donor 1 and donor 2, or TA1 and 2. And that's compared to, again, CPI, which just is an ensemble of alleles, if you will, so it's just one number for all of them. And you can see that the mean information gain here, when we're using all of the information as opposed to CPI, is 10 to the 9th, which is a huge increase. I think it was something like 10 to the 15 was the average for TrueAllele, and something like 10 to the 6th was the average for CPI. So you see this huge increase in information content when you're able to use all of your data, which is kind of the point of probabilistic genotyping. Okay, this is a specificity data for the two-person mixtures. There's 2 of these slides because there were 2 separate mixture sets. On the far right-hand side of the slide are donors 4 and 18 listed in red. So what you're looking at is a comparison between the 2 known donors that were used to create all these mixtures, 4 and 18, versus 18 other randomly selected staff profiles. And you can see that the separation there is something like 35 log units, or 35 orders of magnitude. So there's a huge difference between the actual donor likelihood ratios and the non-donors. Okay, so this is, again, a two-person mixture set. This is the second one, and kind of the similar story there. So, over 35 log units of separation and pretty small standard deviations. This kind of just reinforces the really extreme specificity that we're seeing with TrueAllele. When you're in the mixture, so to speak, your log likelihood ratio is going to be extremely high. When you're not in there, the non-donors, it's very, very negative. Okay, so this is actually the same data. It's all of our two-person mixtures on one slide, and this is some work that Cybergenetics had done. Jennifer over there, if she's listening, thank you for this slide. What essentially they did was, instead of comparing the 2 known donors against 18 non-donors, they compared it against 3,000. So on the right-hand side of this slide is the 3 FBI populations that we're currently using: Black, Caucasian, and Hispanic. For each one of those populations, there are 1,000 randomly generated profiles, so a total of 3,000, which gives us on the top of the slide almost 3.9 million comparisons. And out of all of those, there were only 18 that were false positives or greater than 0. 15 out of those 18 were less than 1, which gives us this kind of microscopic false inclusion rate, or error rate, if you will. And the max was 2.03 for a non-donor. Okay, so moving on to the 3-person mixture data that we have. Similar to the last slide, we're comparing the fully deconvoluted TrueAllele profiles. So in this case, we've got TrueAllele donor 1, 2, and 3 versus the inclusion statistic, or CPI. And the average TrueAllele statistic was something like 10 to the 10, whereas the CPI average was something like 10 to the 5, which gives us a mean information gain of about 10 to the 5. So we've got 100,000 times more information with TrueAllele, even for these 3-person mixtures. Some of them are pretty complex with no separation at all. So again, that's the power of using probabilistic genotyping when you can use all of your data versus the simpler threshold-based method. So this is the specificity data for the 3-person mixture set, and you can see that that separation has decreased a little bit. As you might expect with a 3-person mixture, there's some more uncertainty in the data, and that's reflected in this graph. That said, even with this additional uncertainty for the 3-person mixtures, you can see that there's still a very large amount of separation between the donors and the non-donors. On the far right, we used the samples in red, 12, 16, and 19, to create all of the 3-person mixtures, and now we've got 17 non-donor profiles that we're comparing this against. So we had 2 sets of 3-person mixtures, and this is just showing the second set of that. And what you're seeing is something like a 25, an average of 25 log units of separation between the non-donors and the actual donor profile. Okay, so thanks again to Cybergenetics for this slide. They did a similar thing in comparing 3,000 randomly generated profiles that you see on the right-hand side against all of our 3-person mixture data set. And here we have a few more false positives. There are 79, but 64 out of those 79 were actually less than 1. Which also gives us a very small inclusion rate, false inclusion rate, and the max was less than 2 at 1.87 log units, essentially less than 100. Currently, we have a kind of a limited amount of processors that we're running all our TrueAllele requests on. We've got 16. We're in the process of procuring some more, but it's going to take a couple months. So what we wanted to do here was to try to optimize the number of cycles that we're running our samples on. What you're looking at here is just the single source low template stuff, where we're expecting a lot of stochastic effects, drop in, drop out, that kind of stuff. So the question is, what's really the minimum amount of cycles that we can run our data on without sacrificing the magnitude of the likelihood ratio or either reproducibility? So what we're finding here is that you can really run these types of samples with as little as 5,000 cycles. What you're seeing there under MC time is the readout time, so that would be 10,000 total cycles. But essentially what all this is saying is that you can run these types of samples for 5K and 5K, which really takes something like, I don't know, 15 minutes, and your sample's done without losing any kind of the magnitude in either the log or in reproducibility. Same thing, same study. This time we're looking at two-person mixtures, 1-to-1s, 1-to-2s, and 1-to-5s. And again, we're asking the question, what's really the minimum amount of time that we can run these without sacrificing any of these metrics? So it turns out that there's really no statistical difference whatsoever between running them at a shortened time, like 25,000 cycles, versus 125. So we're able to save a lot of processor space and really maximize the efficiency of the processors that we do have. I ran this for three-person mixtures as well, and it turns out that 50,000 is kind of the magic number for that. One caveat to this is that if you do have very low template contributors, or if you're one of the donors to your mixture is less than 5% of the total, you may have to increase your cycle numbers or add additional replicates. Okay, onto the implementation strategy and casework reporting. Basically, I just want to talk about our approach and how we're going to implement this, and talk about a new method section that we came up with, the new DNA conclusions, and something else that we came up with to replace an allele table, which we are no longer reporting, which kind of makes all the sense in the world if you're thinking about the next couple years when most labs will start to implement these new megaplexes, 23-plex for global filer and powerplex fusion. Writing all those allele tables going to start to get onerous. Okay, so what we decided to do is start out with kind of a small group of forensic scientists here at the lab. I think we're starting with 5, and we've got also a number of supervisors and administrative staff that are also trained to do the reviews. But for those 5 people going forward, hopefully in the next 2 weeks or so, when they start their cases, all of their samples, not some of them, but all of them will be analyzed with TrueAllele. And the benefit of doing that is that we're able to report a single standardized likelihood ratio. It's often the case now with some of our cases that are extremely complex that we have multiple statistics in the same case. So you may have a conditional match probability, you may have a CPI, you may have a PopStats likelihood ratio, throw in the odd YSTR statistic. You've got really kind of this statistical stew. That's hard to testify to. It's complicated. So again, one of the benefits of just using everything, funneling everything through TrueAllele is that we're able to report just one single likelihood ratio, and that's the match form of the likelihood ratio. Again, with the goal of increased reporting consistency, we have just one small set of common conclusions. Hopefully this will streamline the process for us. This also allows us to dispense with the language of inclusion, and by that I mean cannot be excluded, can be excluded, consistent with these phrases that we've been using for the last 10 or 15 years. When you calculate with TrueAllele the match form of the likelihood ratio, all these concepts of inclusion suddenly become irrelevant. So these legacy conclusions that we've been dragging along, it makes all the sense in the world to just leave them behind and move forward with what TrueAllele can do. Okay, in terms of documentation, which is huge for audits, what we came up with was this QA document that we're calling a request and results form. Basically, this allows the analysts to document as they're going along the analyze process. You can see on the left-hand side, we're documenting any rules that may have fired. If you're familiar at all with the software, that would be the analyze module. And document the requests that the analyst is making based on their electropherogram data. So the total number of donors, readout time, did you use a known reference, and so forth. And the second half of that document refers to the results. So for mixture samples, are you seeing convergence between your replicates, and then are your replicates within 2-band, which is a requirement of ours, or 2 log units. We've also added a new method section to our reports, which we currently don't have, but I think this makes all the sense in the world to give the agencies a little bit more information about what it is that we're actually doing. The first bullet point on that methods section, I think that's an audit or an ISO requirement that we provide the kit information that we're using, the amplification chemistry, so that's all that is. The next statement just says that we're replicating our samples. Science reproducibility is a good thing. The next one just tells them that we're using the FBI's databases with a theta of 1%. We're using known reference samples where it may be appropriate. And the last one is simply just really the version number that we're using of TrueAllele. That will change over time, which is a good thing because if you're working with cybergenetics, you know that they're responsive to your requests in the software. Okay, conclusions. This is something that we struggled with for a long time. This is what we came up with. What I tried to do was really eliminate a lot of the jargon that we currently have in our conclusions, because the audience, after all, are non-scientists, they're jurors, they're police agencies. So here's what we came up with for a simple single source match statement. A DNA match was identified between whatever the item description would be and the name of your suspect, victim, whatever. And then the match statement. A match between this evidence item and the person is X times more probable than a coincidental match to an unrelated person. So pretty basic, pretty straightforward, and it's faithful to the math that's underlying this. With a mixture statement, it's actually very similar to that. We're just adding a little bit more information with respect to the number of donors that we're assuming. So you may say that whatever let's say bloodstained knife contains a mixture of DNA from 2 donors, and then it's really the same exact match statement, again, because even for mixtures, the input may be a mixture, but the output with TrueAllele is deconvoluted single genotypes, and then someone would either match that or not. So again, we have that simple match statement. Obviously, there will always be cases where the profile doesn't match. This is a fairly simple no match support statement. No match support was identified between whatever the item was and name. Pretty basic, pretty straightforward. Even with TrueAllele, even though there are no thresholds and even though it's extremely powerful technology, there will always be samples, touch samples and so forth, where you're only recovering maybe one allele, if that. Sometimes it's just flatline. So we have an inconclusive statement as well. Basically, it's due to insufficient genetic information, match support for whoever the person was is just inconclusive. I'll say now that we have something like 57 conclusions that are part of our protocol. Now with TrueAllele, I think we pared that down to something like 8 or 9. So hopefully that'll help us with our streamline our tech review process as well. So I mentioned that we kind of got rid of our allele tables, and we replaced that with this match table. So if you're familiar at all with the software, in the report module, you can see the cybergenetics match table. So what we're essentially doing here is taking that information and putting it into a kind of a simple format for non-scientists. So again, the jurors, the law enforcement agencies that are going to be looking at these reports. So really this just distills the information that's in the report match table. We also currently use allele tables as a demonstrative aid for the jury. We'll frequently blow up the charts to kind of a large size, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, and present these to the jury. So moving forward, this is what we'll present to the jury instead. So if it matches, we'll say match, and we'll give the match statistic, and if it doesn't match, we'll say that as well. And this avoids, the complexities of the allele table. So I'll just leave that at that. And then down below, just our evidence disposition statement. Thanks again to the cybergenetics staff who've been extremely helpful to us over the last couple of months in particular, but I guess over the last many, many years. Thanks also to my lab director and technical leader, Barry, who had the foresight a decade ago to realize that there was a better way to do DNA mixture interpretation in probabilistic genotyping than what we're currently doing with the threshold-based system. And also thanks to the working group, many of whom are here today, that have been kind of steering this process towards implementation for us for the last, I don't know, 8 or 9 months.